Level 1. The idea. Everyone laughed at Mateo Alvarez had spent most of his adult life repairing bicycles in a tiny shop on a quiet street in Austin, Texas. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have a university degree. And nobody in the neighborhood considered him an inventor. To most people, Mateo was simply the guy who could fix almost anything with a wrench, some wire, and a little patience. But Mateo had been noticing something strange. Every week, hundreds of broken bicycles were being thrown away. Bent wheels, old chains, damaged gears, dead batteries from electric bikes. Most of it ended up in dumpsters. One evening, while closing his shop, Mateo found himself staring at a pile of discarded bicycle parts. Then he had an idea. What if those useless parts weren't actually useless? What if old bicycle components could be combined into a mechanical energy storage system? Mateo grabbed a notebook. He began sketching. At first, the idea looked ridiculous. He imagined using bicycle gears to transfer mechanical energy into a storage mechanism, creating something that could later release that energy when electricity was needed. It sounded crazy, even to Mateo, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, he showed his first sketch to his closest friend. His friend stared at the drawing, then laughed. "Mateo, you're trying to build a power station out of bicycles?" Mateo smiled. "Maybe." The idea spread quickly around the neighborhood. People laughed. Some called it a waste of time. One customer told him, "You fix bicycles. Leave engineering to engineers." Mateo heard every joke. But he didn't throw away the notebook. Instead, he started collecting discarded bicycle parts, old gears, chains, metal frames, electric bike components. Every night after closing the shop, Mateo worked alone. His first prototype was terrible. It barely moved. The second one broke apart. The third made a terrible noise and stopped completely. But Mateo kept rebuilding it. Weeks became months. His small repair shop slowly turned into a strange laboratory filled with bicycle parts. People walking past the window would stop and stare. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but Mateo didn't care anymore. One rainy night, he connected his latest prototype. He turned a small metal wheel by hand. The gears began moving. Then something unexpected happened. A tiny indicator light flickered. Mateo froze. He turned the wheel again. The light became brighter. For the first time, his crazy idea had produced usable energy. Mateo slowly smiled. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, and nobody believed him yet. But he had finally proven one thing. The idea wasn't impossible, and that tiny light was only the beginning. Level 2, the prototype. That changed everything. For the next 3 months, Mateo worked on his strange machine almost every night. He stopped telling people about it. There was no point. Everyone had already made up their minds. So Mateo simply kept building. He replaced broken bicycle gears with stronger ones. He tested different chains. He rebuilt the mechanism again and again. Some nights, nothing happened. Other nights, something broke. Once, a gear snapped so violently that it sent pieces across the workshop. Mateo just picked them up and started again. But slowly, the machine began improving. The tiny light that had once flickered for only a few seconds could now stay on much longer. Then Mateo had another idea. Instead of testing the machine with one bicycle component at a time, he connected several mechanical sections together. If one system could produce a small amount of stored energy, maybe 10 systems could produce much more. He spent nearly all his savings buying inexpensive tools and materials. His repair shop became almost impossible to recognize. Bicycle frames hung from the walls. Gears covered the workbenches. Chains ran across the floor. And in the center of the room stood Mateo's strange machine. One afternoon, a local journalist stopped by the shop. She had heard about the man supposedly trying to create an energy system from discarded bicycles. At first, she expected a joke. Instead, Mateo showed her the machine. He turned a large wheel. The gears began moving. A small bank of lights slowly came alive. The journalist stared at them. "That's actually working?" Mateo nodded. But he wasn't satisfied. He knew producing enough energy for a few lights wasn't enough. His dream was much bigger. He wanted the system to store energy and release it later. That was the part nobody believed was possible. So Mateo began testing different storage methods. Day after day, he recorded everything. How long the system ran, how much energy it produced, how quickly it lost power. Then one night, something extraordinary happened. Mateo activated the machine and walked away. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 30. The lights were still on. Mateo couldn't believe what he was seeing. He checked the equipment again. Everything was working. For the first time, his prototype wasn't just producing energy. It was holding it. Mateo immediately called the journalist back, but before she arrived, someone else saw the machine. A local business owner had been walking past Mateo's shop. Through the window, he noticed the lights glowing from a machine made almost entirely from discarded bicycle parts. He walked inside. What exactly is that? Mateo looked at him. For years, people had laughed at his idea. Now, for the first time, someone was asking a different question. Not, why are you doing this? But, can I buy it? Mateo didn't answer immediately, because he suddenly realized something. His crazy idea might not just be possible, it might actually be worth something. Level 3, the offer. The man standing inside Mateo's repair shop was named Daniel Brooks. He owned 3 small businesses across Austin, and he had seen enough failed inventions to know that most strange ideas never became anything. But Mateo's machine was different. Daniel spent nearly an hour examining it. He asked questions. How much did it cost? How much energy could it store? Could it work outside the workshop? Could it be built on a larger scale? Mateo didn't have all the answers, but he had something more important. He had months of notes. Every test, every failure, every improvement. Daniel offered to invest $20,000. For Mateo, it was more money than he had ever had available for an invention. But there was a problem. Daniel wanted ownership of the technology. Mateo refused. He had spent months building the machine when nobody believed in him. He wasn't ready to give away the idea. Daniel left. For a few days, Mateo wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Then he remembered why he started. He wasn't trying to become rich. He wanted to prove that discarded materials could become something useful. So Mateo kept working. He built a second prototype. This one was larger, stronger, and much more efficient. Then he tested it outside his shop. The machine powered several lights throughout the evening. People walking down the street stopped to watch. The same neighbors who once laughed at Mateo were now asking questions. A video of the machine was posted online. At first, almost nobody watched it. Then the video began spreading. Hundreds of views became thousands, then tens of thousands. Messages started arriving from people Mateo had never met. Engineers wanted to inspect the machine. Business owners wanted demonstrations. A small environmental organization offered to help fund another prototype. Mateo suddenly found himself surrounded by people who wanted to be part of his idea. But there was one message that caught his attention. It came from a technology company in California. They wanted Mateo to fly out and demonstrate the machine privately. The offer sounded unbelievable. But Mateo agreed. A week later, he stood inside a huge modern laboratory surrounded by engineers. His machine looked tiny compared with everything around it. One engineer smiled politely, another whispered something to his colleague. Mateo could feel the doubt in the room. Then he switched the machine on. The gears began turning. The energy storage system activated, and the laboratory lights connected to his prototype came alive. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the entire room was silent. Then one of the engineers slowly walked toward Mateo. He looked at the machine, then at Mateo, and finally said, "Where did you learn to build this?" Mateo smiled. "I didn't." The engineer looked confused. Mateo continued, "I just refused to stop trying." That sentence changed everything, because the company didn't want to buy his machine anymore. They wanted to know if Mateo would build the future with them. Level 4, When the world finally took him seriously. The meeting in California changed Mateo's life. The technology company offered him a partnership. They wanted to build a full-scale version of his machine. But Mateo had one condition. He didn't want the technology locked inside expensive buildings. He wanted it to reach ordinary communities. So instead of building one giant system, Mateo proposed something different. Thousands of small units, small enough to operate in neighborhoods, cheap enough for local businesses, and built partly from materials that would normally be thrown away. The engineers were skeptical, but they agreed to test it. Months of work followed. Mateo moved between laboratories, workshops, and manufacturing facilities. For the first time, he had professional engineers working beside him, but Mateo never forgot where the idea came from. His original machine was still sitting inside his old bicycle shop. One afternoon, the team finished the first full-scale prototype. They transported it to a small community center outside Austin. The building had struggled with unreliable electricity for years. That evening, Mateo stood beside the machine as the engineers prepared the final test. A switch was activated. The system began turning, slowly at first, then faster. The lights inside the community center came on. People gathered outside began cheering. Mateo simply stood there, watching. He remembered the nights when he had worked alone, the broken gears, the failed prototypes, the jokes, the people who told him he was wasting his life. Now those same doubts seemed very far away. But Mateo wasn't finished. His invention attracted investors. News organizations began covering his story. Companies wanted licenses, and eventually, the technology began appearing in communities far beyond Texas. Mateo's bicycle repair shop became a symbol of where everything started. The strange machine that once looked like junk had become the foundation of a growing company. Years later, someone asked Mateo what made him continue when everyone else told him to stop. He looked at the old machine in his workshop and smiled. Then he said, "I wasn't trying to prove everyone wrong." He paused. "I just wanted to find out if I was right." And that was the lesson behind Mateo's journey. Sometimes the world calls an idea crazy simply because nobody has seen it work yet. Mateo didn't become successful because everyone believed in him. He became successful because he kept working when nobody did. Level 5. The decision that nearly destroyed everything. Mateo's invention was finally attracting serious attention, but success created a problem he never expected. Several investors wanted to turn his invention into a massive commercial product. They offered him millions. At first, Mateo was excited. Then he read the contracts. The investors wanted to make the system expensive. They wanted exclusive control over the technology, and they wanted to stop Mateo from giving the smaller versions to communities that couldn't afford them. Mateo refused. The investors walked away. Within weeks, funding disappeared. Engineers began leaving the project. The laboratory Mateo had worked in was suddenly almost empty. For the first time since his idea began, Mateo wondered if everything was about to collapse. But then he returned to his old bicycle shop. The original prototype was still there, covered in dust. Mateo stood beside it for a long time. He remembered the first night that tiny light had turned on. Nobody had been there to applaud. Nobody had invested $1. It had simply been Mateo, a broken pile of bicycle parts, and an idea everyone thought was ridiculous. The next morning, he made a decision. He would rebuild the project on his own terms. Mateo reopened his old workshop. He contacted the engineers who still believed in the mission. Slowly, they returned. They worked with limited money and basic equipment, but something strange happened. The smaller the team became, the more focused they were. Instead of building an expensive machine for wealthy companies, they created a simpler version that could be repaired locally. Then they tested it in another small community. This time, the machine worked even better. News of the project began spreading again, and then an unexpected email arrived. It was from an international organization interested in bringing Mateo's technology to communities facing unreliable power. They weren't asking him to sell the invention. They wanted to help distribute it. Mateo stared at the message. Years earlier, people had laughed at his idea because it looked too simple. Now organizations around the world were asking how they could help build it. Mateo smiled. He had finally understood something. The biggest obstacle had never been the machine. It had been convincing himself that he needed everyone else's permission. And once he stopped waiting for permission, everything changed. Level 6. The world was watching. Mateo's small workshop was no longer just a bicycle repair shop. It had become the birthplace of an idea that was beginning to attract attention far beyond Austin. But Mateo still refused to call himself a genius. He kept saying the same thing. I just found a different way to look at something everyone else had already thrown away. The international organization that had contacted him wanted to test his technology in 3 different communities. The first test went smoothly. The second was even better. But the third almost ended the entire project. A major component failed during testing. The machine stopped working. The team had spent months preparing for the demonstration. Now dozens of people were standing there watching. Mateo could have blamed the equipment. He could have blamed the engineers. Instead, he walked toward the machine and said, "Let's find out what went wrong." They worked through the night. They discovered a small weakness in the design. Mateo didn't hide it. He redesigned the component. Then they tested it again. This time, it worked. The organization was impressed. Not because Mateo had created a perfect machine, but because he had shown them something more important. He knew how to improve after failure. Soon, Mateo's technology began attracting international interest. Companies wanted licenses. Universities wanted to study the system. Young inventors began sending Mateo letters about their own ideas. And something unexpected happened. Mateo started receiving photographs from people who had built small versions of his system using recycled materials. Some were students. Some were mechanics. Some were ordinary people experimenting in garages. Mateo realized his invention was becoming more than a business. It had become an idea that other people could build upon. One evening, Mateo returned to his original workshop. The old prototype was still sitting in the corner. He switched it on. The tiny light appeared, the same light that had flickered during his very first successful experiment. Mateo smiled. Years earlier, everyone had laughed at that little machine. Now, people around the world were talking about it. But Mateo knew the story wasn't really about the machine. It was about what happened when one person refused to give up on an idea simply because nobody else understood it. And somewhere in another garage, another person was probably being laughed at for having a crazy idea. Mateo hoped they wouldn't stop. Because sometimes, the idea everyone laughs at today becomes the idea everyone remembers tomorrow. Level 7. The moment. Everything changed. By now, Mateo's invention was no longer a secret. It had been tested by engineers, discussed by companies, and introduced to communities that needed affordable energy solutions. But Mateo still wasn't satisfied. He wanted to know whether his system could survive in the real world, not inside a laboratory. So, his team took the technology to a remote community where electricity was unreliable and replacement equipment was difficult to obtain. They installed a compact version of Mateo's system. For the first few days, everything worked perfectly. Then a severe storm arrived. Heavy rain flooded part of the area. The main power system failed. Communication equipment stopped working. The community went dark. Mateo's team feared the worst. But then they checked his system. It was still operating. The small energy unit continued powering essential lights and equipment. For the first time, Mateo saw his original idea doing exactly what he had imagined years earlier. Not powering a giant corporation. Not making an impressive demonstration. Helping ordinary people when they needed it most. The news spread quickly. Several organizations began contacting Mateo. But this time, Mateo wasn't interested in becoming famous. He wanted to make the technology easier for other people to build and repair, so his team created training programs. They taught local technicians how the machines worked. They opened access to basic design information, and communities began creating their own versions. Then, Mateo received an invitation to speak at a major technology conference. He stood on a huge stage in front of thousands of people. The audience expected to hear about technology. Instead, Mateo talked about failure. He talked about the broken gears, the terrible prototypes, the people who laughed, the investors who walked away, and the tiny light that started everything. Then Mateo said something that stayed with everyone in the room. Don't judge an idea by how strange it looks at the beginning. The audience became completely silent. Mateo continued. Sometimes the world doesn't reject your idea because it's wrong. Sometimes it rejects it because it's too early. The room erupted in applause. He was thinking about the little bicycle repair shop in Austin, the place where nobody believed him, the place where his crazy idea had started, and he finally understood something. He hadn't changed the world because he was the smartest person in the room. He had changed his own future because he was willing to keep working when everyone else had already given up. Level 8. The Legacy. Years passed. Mateo's invention continued to evolve. What had started inside a tiny bicycle repair shop had become a technology used by communities, small businesses, and organizations in different parts of the world. But Mateo never moved into a giant office. He kept his original workshop. The old walls were still covered with bicycle parts. The first prototype was still there. And on one shelf sat the tiny light that had started everything. One afternoon, a teenage boy walked into the shop carrying a box of broken bicycle parts. He looked nervous. "Mr. Mateo," he said, "I have an idea." Mateo smiled. "Tell me." The boy explained his invention. It sounded strange, maybe even impossible. Mateo listened without laughing. When the boy finished, Mateo picked up one of the old gears from his workbench. Then he placed it in the boy's hand. "People laughed at me too," Mateo said. The boy looked surprised. "Did you stop?" Mateo shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the original machine. "That is why you're standing here today." The boy looked at the machine. Then he smiled. Mateo understood that this was the real success. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the companies. It wasn't the awards or the headlines. It was knowing that someone else had walked into his shop with a crazy idea, and instead of laughing at them, Mateo was willing to listen. That evening, Mateo closed the workshop. He stood outside for a moment and looked down the quiet street. Years earlier, he had been just a bicycle mechanic with an unusual idea. Nobody believed him. Nobody expected anything from him. But he kept going. And eventually, the world had to pay attention. Mateo looked back through the workshop window. The tiny light was still glowing. The same light, the same machine, but a completely different life. His story became a reminder that an idea doesn't need everyone to believe in it. Sometimes it only needs one person who refuses to give up. And Mateo had been that person.